welcome all. Thanks for joining us today on the webinar. We're going to be speaking to you today on the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform. My name's Chartu Gamaj. I'm a principal at RMI and I lead our steel sector decarbonisation work within our industries program. So really excited to be talking to you about this initiative today. Before we kick off, we'll have a few housekeeping rules that I was just going to go over, and then we'll get into the content. So all participants in this webinar will be muted. We are going to be recording this session, and this will be made public on the website, and all registered participants will also receive an email link to that. Please write your questions at any time in the chat function. We'll be getting to those at the end of this webinar session. We'll host about 20 to 15 minutes to get all those questions across. But whenever you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop those in, and we'll be recording the thread. So without further ado, I guess let's kick off onto the next slide, please. So just a quick agenda in terms of what we're going to be covering today. So we'll do a quick intro in terms of where we're at and how we got to this type of work and procurement work within our RMI steel portfolio, a little bit of background on that, and then we'll kick into information about the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform, the current RFI that's out at the moment for producers, and then, as I mentioned, a lot of time dedicated towards the end for Q&A. Next slide, please. So just in terms of a way of background in terms of RMI and what we're doing within this sector. So RMI is an NGO, and we're focused on transforming how we produce and use energy. And this is hugely important when we think about heavy industries and transport, at which iron and steel is a large contributor to the emissions pie of those sectors. And when we're thinking about how to decarbonize this sector, we focus on working with all these key stakeholders that you can see in front of you. So in terms of working with producers on first of a kind projects and decarbonizing trajectories, with policymakers in terms of regional economic development and transitioning away from these fossil fuel assets. Over on the financing side, I can say last year we released the Sustainable Steel Principles, the finance team, which works with financiers and lenders to establish measurement and disclosure for their steel portfolios. And lastly, the topic of this conversation today is working with purchasers and thinking about how we can enable buyers to establish a climate differentiated market and to establish the investment case for these clean steel products. So working across the stakeholder and supply chain for iron and steel decarbonization, and that's where we're focusing on today in terms of the purchasing side. So the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform, we launched this this year at New York Climate Week, and we have two primary goals with this initiative. One, as I mentioned, is to accelerate the investment case for breakthrough technologies for near zero emission steel assets and getting those built and off the ground this decade. And the second one of establishing this platform is to create a place for iron and steel supply chain industries, policymakers, and fellow NGO partners to engage in topics related to the procurement of sustainable steel. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you are aware, if you've joined this call and interested in sustainable steel and its purchasing, steel is a huge issue in terms of decarbonization and getting us on the right path to 1.5C alignment, taking a step back and thinking about what is needed to achieve net zero steelmaking by 2050. There's several levers that can be pulled, but on a technology perspective, looking on a global scale, we can see that a lot of the actions and initiatives that need to be made sit within accelerating the secondary steelmaking availability, so scrap. But then a lot of the main focus and where the deep cuts in emissions will come from really sit within achieving these near zero emissions iron making technologies. So be that with natural gas abatement, green hydrogen, bioenergy, there's lots of different technology pathways, but they can be bucketed into deep emissions from baseline blast furnace steel making. There's also carbon capture that utilizes that, and between those two technologies, we are over 50% of what it needs to take in terms of technology deployment to get to net zero by 2050. And we're really trying to bend the shape of that curve, as with all net zero alignment. So the amount of technology and assets that we need to be seeing being built by 2030 and 2040 and 2050 rapidly increase. And so this is the, I guess, the ideation of this topic of seeing what can we do between these different stakeholder groups with and purchasing power to get these assets online as quickly as possible. So our focus within the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform, our first, I guess, campaign is really focused around North America procurement. And the question that we get asked quite often is, why focus on North America? And the federal US incentives really are driving a lot of that focus. So first, thinking about the, I guess, the right-hand side of this slide and what the levelized cost implications of the recent IRA incentives and how that plays out when we think about, you know, several decarbonized or emissions reduction pathways. So the first one being the blast furnace with CCS. Then you're thinking about natural gas with CCS, and then eventually to a hydrogen-based DRI or direct reduction pathway. And you can see with these different subsidies, so 45Q, the hydrogen PTC, for example, and stacking these for levelized costs, it's starting to become quite competitive with these incumbent technologies. So all of these now approving a price point that is, you know, within earshot to these incumbent pathways. And then matching these, if we look towards what the emissions footprint of these pathways all equate to, we can see that a typical blast furnace is ranging to a 2.4 tons of CO2 per ton, and then consistently going down based on the, I guess, decarbonized pathway. And comparing that to, I guess, the existing and current standards in responsible steel, there's several of these technologies that are considered to be deep decarbonization technologies. So those that are highlighted in the red box. And a lot of these will obviously vary depending on grid intensity, upstream methane leakage, and so on. And that is going to be dependent asset by asset. But this is just to give you an idea of saying that different technologies, while maybe becoming even in cost competitiveness, you know, the emissions is obviously what's driving the difference between what these assets will produce. Next slide, please. So why do demand aggregation and the idea between the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform, which we'll get into in a little bit? We know that decarbonizing iron and steel is a huge and mammoth effort, and to put a scale on this and why we think buyers coming together is necessary is really just because of the sheer size and volume of what it takes to transition or produce an additional green steel asset. So a typical 2 million ton steel plant and converting that over to, let's say, a green hydrogen pathway does require, you know, the equivalent of 2 gigawatts of electrolyzers. And that's, you know, quite a large percentage when we think about the installed capacity today, but certainly, you know, a small contributor in what needs to be achieved when we think about economy-wide decarbonization throughout. What aggregation of demand and buys gives us in the steel context is the ability for the purchasing power of multiple companies to come together to be able to demand a volume such as a 2 million ton or in the million ton capacity range, as opposed to the one-to-one negotiations that are happening today. And so when we think about what does it mean to demand and look at aggregation of green steel, we thought about the commitments that are emerging and accelerating within the space. So a lot of companies are looking at their Scope 3 emissions and setting targets towards decarbonizing not only their iron and steel supply chain, but other key elements that they're using in their products. And so what we did at RMI is to translate some of these commitments into what the equivalency would be in terms of steel offtake. And so in 2030, there was a, I guess, a cumulative addition of around 6.7 million tons. So that's around, you know, let's say 3 to 4 equivalent in facilities of green steel that we required if we aggregated 60 companies to meet their sustainability targets. And these are all coming from folks that have joined up to things such as the First Movers Coalition, or have set their own Scope 3 emissions reduction targets, etc. And so the two slices of this bar chart represent that, from just the aggregated view of what the type of commitment was, and then translated over to the end use sector type. So we can see a lot of these commitments have been driven by automotive companies, and then building an infrastructure. So quite typical in terms of also the emissions impact on their own supply chain and doing that. But this exercise in aggregating these numbers really gives us confidence and shows us that there is commitments being made by these companies. And so looking for a way for these companies to be able to actually procure this type of steel is the next step. And so how do you translate these commitments into offtake? And so based on this idea, we're really trying to scale up this ambition. So as we know, over the several past years, corporates have set targets and pledges individually, and also have joined buyers alliances such as the climate group Steel Zero and the First Movers Coalition, and set these intentions for decreasing their Scope 3 emissions. And then over time, we've been seeing producers doing a great job in terms of operational improvements, as well as looking towards increase in scrap and looking at that route in terms of lowering their emissions footprint of their products. So companies have been undertaking these and also offering similar certification of their products to differentiate them in the market today. And so when we think about this market scaling and the investment needed to reach near zero emissions ore-based steelmaking or primary-based steelmaking, we see that as a way to be able to scale and go up the learning curve in terms of bringing on the technology that's needed to bring that along, and the shift that's needed. And so we launched the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform in an effort to bring together committed buyers to demand for these types of near zero emission steel as a collective. And that will hopefully enable the capital investment and the technology shift needed to get there. Next slide, please. So I'll pass over now to my colleague Lachlan. He'll go into the details of the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform. And so we'll spend a bit of time on that. As I mentioned, any questions that you have during this time, please put them in the chat. Lachlan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chats. And as Chats said, we have a little bit of background there about steel decarbonization and how we ended up launching this platform. And so I'll talk through some of the specifics of what the platform is and how we envision it working to push towards that investment case. So at a very high level, we kind of have three big buckets of things that we're trying to do with this platform. The first is to identify the buyers and kind of bring together a group of steel buyers who have commitments and understand what they need in terms of a transaction. And then through that sort of group, we'll be facilitating a procurement process. And there's two stages within that process: a request for information and a request for proposal. And we'll talk a little bit more detail about what does that look like. And then at the end of all of that, really what we want is to develop what those supply options look like in order to have that near zero emission steel come onto the market, and then have the buyers-led kind of RFP support the investment case for those by moving into individual offtakes from each of the buyers involved in the process. So the four logos that you see here are the initial group of buyers: Microsoft, Nextracker, Trammell and Invenergy, who are participating in the platform, and we're still going through the process now of bringing more buyers on board as we move through. And in conjunction with that, we've also been working closely with the First Movers Coalition. So as Chat said, there's been a great amount of work done between First Movers and others in the space in order to kind of get people's commitments lined up. And so, First Movers has also been working on what they call the Near Zero Steel 2030 Challenge, is kind of a broad look at what can be done in order to start to meet on those targets, and then kind of filtering down through a supplier database, and then kind of our effort here sitting at the end of that filter as kind of very specific RFP focused within a specific region in order to make sure that we can move into those final offtakes. So as I said, we've designed this around kind of a two-stage process. The first is a request for information. So that's a request for information going out to steel producers on behalf of the buyers group. And the idea with the RFI is to just test the initial feasibility of the market for producing near zero emission steel. So in particular, what we really want to understand from the steel producers is, what's possible in terms of the technologies that they might be able to bring to market. What would the timelines look like for bringing those technologies in? And then what would they need to see within a kind of offtake agreement in terms of volume and contract length in order to be able to move forward with an investment case? And the idea is we'll take back all of the information from the RFI and work with the buyers group to come out with an RFP, a request for proposal. And in that request for proposal, the buyers would then be more specific about the emissions threshold they want to see, what volume they are interested in purchasing. And the idea would then be to kind of price whatever is the green premium associated with achieving that emissions threshold in that RFP. So we have those first two steps, which is where the group will be working as a collective on the RFI and the RFP and understanding what is the green premium just to meet emissions. And that will be defined against some sort of common benchmark. So either crude steel or potentially something further upstream in terms of an iron product, for example. And then on the basis of that, each of those buyers will then start to negotiate their individual offtake agreements, where they'll need to understand, the specific steel type that they're purchasing, what is the price for the underlying steel, all the kind of normal commercial arrangements that they would come to. But it would be based on that initial green premium that's associated with how the emissions can be reduced. So in order to do that, we kind of have several different buyers working together. And so we've been working through different potential contracting models that those buyers could use in order to interact with that steel producer. Because often what we see in this supply chain is the kind of potential willingness to pay for a green premium in order to reduce your emissions in your scope 3 upstream supply chain will sit at different parts in the supply chain. And that necessarily means there are some different kind of contracting models that need to be used. So the simplest here is just a direct offtake. And so the one that most often comes up here in terms of the buyers is the automotive, who are directly purchasing sheet or hot rolled coil or whatever they need from a steel mill. And so they have a direct commercial relationship there and can use that to request for near zero emission steel. The next one is sort of in between, where potentially there's a company that sits with a few suppliers in the middle between them and the steel maker, who might form it or do some other work on the steel for them. And most often this has come up in construction, where the building developer might be interested in lowering the embodied emissions of the steel used in the building, but they'll have several suppliers in between. And so the way that would work is that the construction company would kind of reach around, do the negotiations for the offtake in terms of the green premium and the low emission steel that they want to see, and then they would issue that to their intermediate suppliers for them to use in normal kind of supply chain. And the last one here is for the most complicated supply chains that we've seen as we talk to different buyers. So if we start to think about supply chains that might have 10 or 15 steps between the purchaser and the steel mill, it becomes very difficult for those buyers to be able to influence and be able to push their entire supply chain to use all of the steel from one particular kind of low emission steel facility. And so there we've been looking at potential for a complete decoupling of the emissions performance from the steel product itself. So a similar model that is used, for example, in purchasing green electricity. And so that would enable the end use buyer with that complicated supply chain just to purchase the emissions attributes. And separately, the steel would follow its normal kind of flow in the supply chain. So as we work through with the buyers group, we anticipate there'll be a number of kind of issues. So the contracting model, I guess, is already the first one of those that come up. But thinking through a number of ways that they will need to specify how they want to purchase near zero emission steel, particularly thinking of the difficulties of working with a group. And so one of the ones that have come up here is where to set that benchmark on how we might define the emissions performance of green steel in the beginning. And so there's been already a number of efforts and work being done here between Responsible Steel and others on defining a benchmark, particularly at crude steel, and how that might work, and accounting for the amount of scrap that falls into these different products. Another discussion that we've been having with some of these buyers is that they already potentially purchasing from electric arc furnaces with relatively high scrap fractions going into that product, but they're concerned about the emissions from the primary material that is coming into those. And so to look at that, then we can look at potentially specifying a product further upstream. So for example, HBI that might go into multiple different electric arc furnaces. And in that way, they can, again, sort of use some of those contracting models where they might reach around, purchase that green iron product, and then direct that to be used in the existing electric arc furnaces, which already have kind of the rolling mills and other infrastructure that they need for their specific products. And in that way, they're able to kind of tackle the very high emissions portion of the supply chain that sits furthest upstream from them without having to make too many interruption to the existing supply chain. So this is kind of just one example of the process that we expect to run through with the buyers as part of this this process, in order for them to be able to make decisions against each of these kind of key elements that will need to go into the RFP. Another one, of course, is how to define what do we mean by near zero emission steel. So as I said, there's a lot of work that's already been done here. Responsible Steel, SBTi, IEA, and others have put a lot of work into understanding what does the emissions profile look like, and what does that look like against other technologies, which are kind of shown here on this schematic against the kind of responsible steel sliding scale thresholds that are based on the amount of scrap that goes into each of those products. And really, as Chat said at the beginning, what we're focused on here is how do we make the investment case for a step change in emissions. So we're thinking about the highest levels here, responsible steel level 4, or the definition that the First Movers Coalition uses, which is just very similar. And our hope then is by focusing on that area, we're able to bring forward the projects that would need to happen, capital projects that would need to happen to move into that area. So things like bringing in hydrogen to direct reduction facilities, or potentially adding CCS to those types of facilities. And by focusing on that area, then we understand what the costs are associated with those projects, and can have the buyer support being very specifically targeted into those projects in order to bring them forward more quickly. So as I said, we've been focusing around how do we bring these different groups of buyers together that purchase different types of steel, and have them work together in a process that is moves more quickly then towards the individual offtakes that they will need to sign to both meet their Scope 3 emissions targets, and then those offtakes are sort of being a key unlock for the financing on seeing some of these near zero emission steel projects deployed in North America. So as I said, kind of across each of those different types of contracting options across the buyers that we've already spoken to, we've already seen kind of some of those be more applicable to different end use buyer industries. And so then the next challenge is kind of how do we make sure that those can work together seamlessly. And we've done something similar with this across a number of different areas. So originally with renewable power, what eventually became the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, but also with aviation fuel on Saba, looking at shipping and kind of low leakage methane, natural gas as well. And so our aim here with this process is really to kind of bring together all of these buyers, work with these different contracting models to be able to accelerate towards those offtake agreements. So as I said, the kind of first step in that process is the request for information, which is open now. And the request for information is coming from this buyers group. And the idea here is that we want to hear from steel producers or others that might be involved in kind of the steel supply chain, in order to get some information that makes sure that we can design the RFP in a way that then it can be, attractive and able to be responded to by the steel producers. So the RFI covers kind of a number of different areas. The first one that we're looking at is what is on the producer side the preferred way, I guess, to define the products. In particular, what are those benchmarks and the different standards that you might use to define near zero emission steel. We've also asked the producers a number of questions in there about how they might prefer the contract to be structured. So thinking about selling multiple different products from a single mill, or whether they would need to use some sort of chain of custody methods on their side in order to be able to move around near zero emission steel and satisfy all of the different products that will be needed across kind of this diverse range of buyers that are working as a group through the platform. And then the next piece in the RFI is really asking about pricing structure. So not actually what the price is itself, but how producers might prefer to set up the pricing structure. So what is the benchmark, as I said, and then how might that change over time in terms of a green premium? Does it need to be kind of fixed, or does it need to escalate with certain kind of input costs? And what is the preferred way to set that up from a producer perspective? And then the next kind of set of questions are really around what does the projects look like, and what is kind of the lead times for some of those to be able to bring that online, and the capability of the company to bring that to fruition. So in terms of thinking about what technologies are already in the pipeline, what projects have already been studied, whether the companies have already considered external fiscal support, thinking particularly in North America with the tax credit support that Chats mentioned earlier. And then kind of some general questions about the company's ability to both develop those kinds of projects and also to deal with kind of emissions disclosure and other kind of aspects of how that might work. So as I said, the RFI is open now. We're inviting all interested producers. It's open publicly to anyone to have a look. But inviting all interested producers to kind of submit their responses to the RFI by the 25th of November. And then we'll be taking those RFI responses back to the buyers group and working through, as I said, kind of a series of decisions with that buyers group and along the lines of the examples that I provided today. And then that will kind of formulate the RFP documentation itself, which will be coming out at the beginning of next year. So I think that's everything in terms of the presentation. And then we can open it up at this point for questions. Sorry, I'm just looking through the questions.
Yeah, hi all. I'm Maeve. I'm an associate RMI supporting steel sector decarbonization work in the Climate Aligned Industries program. I'll be kicking off our Q&A. So one attendee is wondering how the green premium will be assessed and whether or not the premium will vary across sectors for specific steel product categories. If one of you can answer that, that would be great.
Yeah, so I can go that. So the idea that we have is that the green premium should be the same across all of the different buyers just to that benchmark. So, you know, for example, crude steel, or if it's upstream for a green iron product. And then that would be the basis of which each of the individual buyers would negotiate their offtakes. And so then if there was some other kind of emissions reductions that was happening downstream of that. So for example, if the benchmark is at crude steel, and the buyer is saying, I'm also, you know, reducing the amount of natural gas used in rolling, and therefore this product will be lower for the hot rolled coil. That would be handled separately as part of those individual offtakes. But our idea is to establish what does the green premium look like just to that benchmark as a group.
And as a follow-up to that, is the green premium a technical premium, or is it derived on or from the responses from the questionnaire? From the RFP.
From the RFP. Yeah. So we won't be defining kind of a cost-based kind of paper exercise. What we really want to understand through this process, through the RFP, is, you know, what are the producers willing to price the green premium at? So obviously kind of Chat's put up that slide earlier where we've done some of that modeling to understand what we think it might be, what are the potential ranges, and what impacts the federal support, either through tax credits or other initiatives, might have on the green premium. And really what we want to do through this process is kind of test the market more specifically, understand what is the project and what is the green premium associated with that. And the idea here is really we want to make sure then that we find a match between these ambitious buyers and whatever green premium is left after that federal support, in order for the contracting to be happen on that basis and move those projects forward.
Great. There are a few questions on the names of the buyers supporting this initiative and who is developing the RFP. So if one of you could reiterate the buyers that are involved to date, that would be great.
Yeah, so the buyers so far that have joined up, just trying to use the slides to go back, is Microsoft, Nextracker, a solar company, Trammell Crow company, which is a construction building developer, and Invenergy as a solar, wind, renewable energy project developer. So the RFP will be developed by the buyers. RMI's role here is to just kind of facilitate that group to work together in order to come up with the RFP documentation. But the eventual decisions, I guess, are all made by the buyers throughout that process. And so it's still open for other buyers to join the platform up until kind of the RFP comes out. But as of now, those are the 4 that have joined the platform.
Another question that has come up is, will the producers have to follow the average green premium that is decided amongst the group, or can the producer dictate their own?
Yeah, so the idea would be that the producers will respond to the RFP with whatever the green premium is for their project. And then the buyers will kind of review all of the responses they get to the RFP and decide which ones they want to move forward to negotiate individual offtake agreements with. So the premium, we're not trying to kind of set it across all of the set a premium that needs to be followed. Instead, we want to understand from the producer side what is the premium for the specific projects that they want to bring forward to achieve near zero emission steel, and then kind of have the matchmaking between the producers and the buyers where that makes sense.
Great. Another question is, will the end buyer be able to make decisions based on the name of the producer, or will it somehow be anonymized? And how will these technical and quality questions be managed?
Yeah, so the RFI responses, we plan to kind of aggregate those and share those with the buyers group. So you wouldn't be able to identify each individual producer through the RFI process. And in part, that's just because we really just want to understand through the RFI what the overall landscape is with the producers and what types of projects they're considering and how they might want to structure the contracts. And then when we get to the RFP stage, that's when the buyers would be able to see the individual producers that are responding to that. And the idea is to form that matchmaking then, right? So that once they know they've seen an RFP that they like the green premium setup and like the project that's put forward, then they can move into individual negotiations with that particular producer to move towards an offtake agreement. And then I guess the second part of that question is, we're trying to make sure in this process that most of the kind of technical negotiations will happen in that individual process, right, between the buyer and producer. That's why, the upstream part is only defining the green premium and will be on some sort of common benchmark product like crude steel or something further upstream of that. Because we know that the individual buyers will have specific requirements out of the products that they're buying, and they're buying all sorts of different products. And so we want to make sure that that still stays as kind of a bilateral individual relationship between the steel buyer and the steel producer.
Great. We have another question on the sort of contracting models, specifically book and claim. Is that going to be based on a mass balancing model for CO2 emissions or some other mechanism?
Yeah, so I should have said that our focus with the initial purchasing effort will be around kind of the 2 models that have a direct linkage, because the book and claim requires essentially more market infrastructure in order to make sure that it works. So potentially mass balancing could still be used in some of these direct methods, depending on the level of mass balancing that we're talking about. Mass balancing at a site versus kind of at a group level can be quite different, but that will be kind of specified as we work through the RFP. And then the book and claim, requires kind of a registry system and a way to track the way that when certificates are purchased and when they're retired, and those kind of market infrastructure. And so that will take a little bit more time to develop. And so we're necessarily kind of focusing on the direct offtakes for this initial purchasing effort, just because that can happen a little bit more quickly. But we do understand too, there's a large section of the market out there that face this challenge in terms of not being able to influence their supply chain, because it is has so many tiers between them and the steel producer, and that's why we think there is some value, I think, in developing some of these solutions. It just takes a little bit more time than the direct offtake approach.
We have another great question on claiming net zero steel from the producer side. So this attendee mentions that on one side you call out absolute scope 3 as a real concern of end buyers. So will there be clarity through the Sustainable Steel Buyers platform to identify which steel producers are using mass balancing or carbon offsets or other mechanisms to achieve this near zero steel claim?
Yeah, so I mean, that will be defined through the RFP. I should say, generally coupling of offsets is not what the buyers group is looking for through this process. They do want to see projects happening and sort of direct emissions abatement as occurring as a result of that. But in terms of then what claims can be made and what chain of custody is appropriate to transfer those claims from the producer to the buyer, that will need to be worked through as part of the RFP. We do see that, between different levels of mass balancing, for example, I think there's some value in some of those approaches. When we think about multiple different product buyers coming together that purchase different types of steel, if there is a need to kind of move near zero emissions slab of some upstream product between different rolling mills just to kind of satisfy that might cause more issues or limit the market size. And so we're trying to get the balance right, I think, between being able to be cast the net as wide as possible, make sure that we get kind of these projects coming forward and we're establishing the links between those buyers and producers, while at the same time maintaining the integrity of those claims and really making sure that this is driving towards those near zero emission steel projects, I should say, coming online. That is our kind of overall goal with this whole process.
Great. And would you be able to sort of reiterate how we are defining near zero or what we might be recommending?
Yeah, so as I said, the buyers will eventually need to make the decision, but essentially what we're thinking about in terms of near zero emission steel is kind of this highest level of performance against something defined like responsible steel, or the First Movers Coalition uses a similar definition. So these are based on a sliding scale in terms of the amount of scrap that's used, but we're talking about a product that's going to have less than kind of 400 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ton of steel. And when we think about then what the current kind of products in the market are, that, we're representing kind of a step change on that in particular when we're thinking about the primary component. And then, so as I said, for some buyers that are already buying steel with relatively high amounts of scrap, they may want to focus just on that primary piece and then have that flow into those existing supply chains. Again, just focusing on tackling that very high emissions portion of material that's currently used within their supply chain, and bringing that through in order to kind of tackle that, not just the direct emissions that they have from the individual producer they might be buying from, but thinking about the overall supply chain that they're connected to. So this is kind of the definitions we have in mind. But as I say, based on the feedback we get from the RFI and then working with the buyers group, we'll finalize the definition that will go into the RFP itself.
We have another question. The list of steel producers and those not on the list have very different capabilities. Who distinguishes what project goes to what producer, or is this aggregated for one producer?
Yeah, so the idea here is that each of the buyers would be able to link directly to one producer, I guess, that comes out of this as kind of the one that has the best project coming forward. And so in terms of its emissions performance, but we understand too that those buyers also have specific products, and some producers may not be able to meet all of those products. And so that is some of the questions that we want to understand through the RFI. What is the capability of the different producers to meet that product suite, I guess? And then how critical it is in terms of, well, what level of information would be required for the producer to understand whether or not they can meet all of the different products without getting into the full kind of specifications. And then, as I said, another piece that we're thinking about here is necessarily by having a benchmark further upstream, whether the buyer, can buy crude steel, even though that's not actually what they want, and then potentially direct that material to someone else in the supply chain or a standalone rolling mill in order to be able to use that near zero emission steel in the specific products that they will need in their kind of final whatever they're making. So we understand there's kind of a suite of different products, and as I said, we want to understand more about what each producer is capable of providing through the RFI, and then we'll try and tailor exactly the amount of information that is given from the group in terms of what products they want, without getting into too much detail that it interrupts kind of the normal bilateral negotiations that will need to happen as part of the offtake agreements.
Great. We have a question about renewable procurement for the production of near zero steel. One attendee is asking if you could talk a little bit more about how there will not be double claiming for renewable procurement and how to ensure that RECs will not be unbundled from the energy supplier in the production chain.
Yeah, so I mean, we've had a lot of discussions with this in other parts of our work, mostly how we've kind of dealt with the question of renewable procurement on the steel producer's side, and then kind of making a steel product claim based on that, is to lay out a hierarchy of different options, particularly thinking about markets where there isn't something available other than unbundled RECs, which is not true of the North American market. But basically what we've said is that the preference is, for a PPA or something like that. Obviously, if there's a direct connection, that would be first. And then we'll kind of lay out the options that move down from there. And so that will also be included as kind of the part of the specifications that will be in the RFP once the buyers have had a chance to kind of review all of the RFI information. But our aim here is to make sure that the projects are tightly coupled. So if we're thinking about a hydrogen DRI, for example, if that was coming forward, we want to see that there is some level of link between the renewable energy that would be going into a green hydrogen product, and then that green hydrogen product is obviously being fed directly into the steel mill. And so if that's a contractual relationship like a PPA, that might be all right. But as long as there is a way to kind of prove that those two things are linked, I think that'll be the key that the buyers want to see. And they need to see that integrity, I guess, for them to be able then to start to make claims about Scope 3 emissions reductions on the back of that. So we hope by specifying all of those kind of elements within the RFP, we can start to see this flow throughout the supply chain.
Great. We have a question about future procurement. So when a buyer indicates a volume of near zero steel they want to buy, is this for a future year when it is available? And how does that buying commitment for the future fund the changes that steel producers need to be making now?
Yeah, so part of the discussion that we've been having with buyers up until this point is to say, as Chat's mentioned, there's been a lot of great work done already in terms of using the amount of increasing the amount of scrap to reduce the amount of emissions in products. But we're thinking about now, what are the step change projects that will need to happen in order to further reduce emissions beyond what's already possible in terms of blending in scrap and procuring green electricity. And so when we think about projects, then we necessarily know that there needs to be kind of a lag between when the commitment is made and when the steel is kind of actually delivered. And so thinking about the commitments on the buyer's side, a lot of those, first movers commitment, for example, is targeting 2030 as when they need to actually achieve these emissions reductions within their supply chain. And then to achieve something by 2030, when we're saying like that project will take several years to come online, right? And so you need to kind of establish an offtake agreement, which is kind of the hardest commitment that a buyer can give, that they're interested to purchase that product in order for that steelmaker then to go raise the capital, do the engineering, and deploy that project. So we're thinking about these offtake agreements happening, at the end of this process in the next year or so, for steel delivery that won't happen for 2, 3, or 4 years after that, because those projects actually need to be developed.
Great. And could you clarify or confirm whether or not RECs and offsets are allowed to meet the near zero steel definition that we are recommending throughout the process?
Yeah, so offsets definitely won't be included. And then some level of renewable energy certificate will be used for electricity. And then it'll just define on whether it's unbundled or whether it needs to be part of a long-term PPA and things like that. Those will be the questions that are still to be determined as part of the RFP. But for sure, we don't want to move into a space where we're using offsets from outside the supply chain. We're very focused on how to reduce emissions within kind of the core boundary that's defined by Responsible Steel, IEA, and others.
Great. One other question is just looking at other buyers group alliances that exist to help aggregate low emission steel demand across the US and globally. So wondering how the SSBP is related to these other existing buyers group initiatives like FMC and Steel Zero.
Yeah, so as I said, those groups have mostly focused on the commitments from buyers to buy. The first movers commitment, for example, is buying 10% of their steel according to the near zero emissions threshold by 2030. And Steel Zero has some other kind of commitments that are defined differently, but I think those are kind of corporate level commitments, which are great. That sets the level of ambition that those steel buyers want to see that near zero emission steel coming online, and they have a goal, I guess, to reduce their emissions. The way that we see the platform working is really just a process to help those types of buyers deliver on those targets that they've set for themselves. So if they've set a First Movers Coalition target, how do they start to deliver on that? They need to think about kind of a procurement process, bringing on projects that can meet that near zero emissions threshold, and then kind of getting that into their own supply chain by 2030. And so we're really designing this process as a way to deliver on those commitments. So buyers that are joining the platform are not making another commitment. All they're doing is participating in this process in order to be able to bring forward those projects. So it's about kind of implementation versus target setting, I think, between the work that we want to do here and the great work that's already been done by efforts like First Movers and Steel Zero.
Great. I'm not seeing any additional questions that we haven't already covered. If I have missed any questions, please feel free to email Lachlan or Chatu for additional information. But I think we are ready to wrap up. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.